Hello. Everyone settle down, please. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm H. Patel, and I'm so excited to have the opportunity to introduce our speaker for today, Ms. Gita Goven, who is currently the CEO of Arch Design and Chair of Africa 123. She'll be talking about transforming Kosovo and exploring strategies for the Kosovo settlement, home to 4,500 households on just 19 hectares, and also focusing on the de-densification for a safer, more sustainable future. Let's welcome Ms. Gita Goven with a huge round of applause.
Oops. Right, I've learned to drive. Good afternoon, everyone. Really great to see you all. I was just reminded that I arrived in the city when I was 19 and spent 2 years working in India at this sort of age, building integrated rural development projects, housing, biogas systems, etc., just outside Surat. So it's wonderful to see you all, and thank you for the invitation to share my work. ARG Design is a company that does urban design, planning, architecture, and environmental management. I have consciously always chosen to work within multidisciplinary practices, and I have always also run practices that do that spectrum of work. I come from a city that's very divided, Cape Town in South Africa, and our cities have an embedded spatial apartheid footprint. So I'm going to be sharing with you the work that I have done over many, many years as an practitioner activist. In South Africa, many of us come from struggle roots, and what we were very clear about was that we had to overthrow the old government and try and rework the city structure so that more people could have the freedom to be who they are and to have better opportunities in life and work. Sorry, this is working, right? Is this disturbing? Is that better? Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to start. Kosovo informal settlement, the numbers vary, so don't be worried. I've been working in this area for 20 years and not much change has happened, but suddenly now things are picking up a pace, and so the numbers will vary slightly because they reflect from the different stages at which we were working. Land is a very contested commodity, and so the difference in the numbers are a reflection of many parcels of land that we were consolidating, some of which we haven't achieved. In order to develop or upgrade this informal settlement, we had to find additional land elsewhere and assemble it, on behalf of the government and make it available for relocating some of the people from Kosovo. And each of these sites then has a different strategy, and that's what I'm interested to share with you. There are quite a few slides. I'm going to flash through them quite quickly. Don't worry about it. This is a repository of work which you're welcome to access and have a look at. And don't worry about the detail. What I want to share with you is the thinking and the approach that we have taken in the work that we've done. Cape Town is at the bottom of Africa, and it's a peninsula into the ocean. We have the Indian Ocean currents coming on the one side and the Atlantic Ocean currents on the other side. As you can see from the topography here, the city, the city is landlocked between mountains and the ocean on two sides, mountains on this side over there, and you can just lightly see the footprint of the actual city. So we have something called the urban edge that restricts beyond which you can build. And after 1994, when we gained our independence, there was a massive rush of people who came back to the cities who had been forcibly removed from the cities. So we had a very rapid pace of urbanization, and there was not much preparation to receive the people who were coming back, rightfully coming back to the places they had been displaced from. So Cape Town as a city is a polycentered city. This is the old city, Cape Town. Sorry, this point is a bit temperamental. The big circle, Cape Town, CBD, is the original historical city settled in 1652. Wynberg is another CBD, which is predominantly colored and Indian people. Khayelitsha is a CBD, which is African people, settled in the 80s, very rapidly built as a settlement for 1 million people. And next to it is a little tan colored kind of space as well, which is a space for colored people. And where it says Belleville is where the rich Afrikaans whites generally live. So forgive me for the racial classifications, but it's very real in our city. And the way where people live and how they operate in the city is very much dictated by these racial backgrounds we come from. The red colored in bits is indicating where the informal settlers have come and located. And it's largely along one of our national routes that goes through the city. They've chosen well because it gives them access to transport and the opportunity for access to work. Coming in closer, you see the mountains to the left. You see Mitchell's Plain, I beg your pardon, there's a spelling typo there. 1 million people, Khayelitsha, 1 million people. The pink indicates the poorer suburbs. This area used to be a sea in the old days, so it's got very loose sand, very, very high water table. In winter, the water sits that much below the surface. We have the highest tuberculosis rate in that part of the world, And the poorest are located there. It's very windy, it's very harsh. We shouldn't have built there, but we have. The airport is in the middle of the city, and the red blob is called Philippi, which has been one of the later settlements of the poor. People who arrived in Philippi have been forcibly removed for up to 7 times before they got here. So the history of family breakdown, the difficulties of relocation, the difficulties of constantly moving annually from fire to flood reflects the kind of survival basis on which people are living there. The PHA is called the Philippi Horticultural Area. It's essentially a hydroponic medium above an aquifer, and it grows 60% of our vegetables, which gets transported 11 kilometers to the Epping market, to the richer areas, and then gets sent back. And the food that people access in the pink areas, which we call a food desert, is thus deteriorated and very, very expensive. Generally, people can... You okay? Do I have to do anything? Use this one rather. Okay, is that better? Great. So this gives you the lie of the land. The lighter colored green areas are conservation areas. We have a very high biodiversity, weak soils, but very rich biodiversity. So those are all preservation areas. And the yellow blobs that you see are indicating the kind of density of jobs available. So you can see that the labor pool is in the heart of the city, and the jobs are all surrounded elsewhere. So any poor person living within the pink area spends up to between 40 and 60 to 80% of their income just on the transport costs. This now is a closer look at the Kosovo informal settlement. The yellow area is what it is. The other bits of land that you see are the bits of land that we've been negotiating for the last 20 years. And now finally we're working only on the yellow bits. In order to upgrade that land, this alternative site on the left, which is colored in pink, was found, and that is in the ownership of a community trust, and I will talk about that briefly. The blue area I will not talk about because it's interesting and useful, but it's very conventional kind of housing, but it's also part of the project, and we built 350 houses over there. To give you a sense of the grain of this part of the city, you'll see that the areas in black were settled since 1993. For every starter house that was given of about 25 square meters, every plot which was started off at 110 square meters down to 70 square meters has got between 3 and 5 shacks in the backyard. So even that is a ghetto. But the area where I've said number 1 is Kosovo, number 3 is Vusi, and number 2 is called the Wedge. Now, the whole of that lozenge-shaped space that 2 and 3 sit in used to be part of farmed land, and the city has decided reluctantly to rezone it for agricultural purposes. So in looking at this project, I said to the province, please don't employ me and please don't pay me your fees. I don't want to earn any more money from you for projects you don't build. You've got to find more land and more money because I don't like what you're doing. We've done 10s and 15 projects of this nature that you haven't built. So they gave us a bit of freedom to show them. I said, show me what money you have available to spend and I'll show you how to spend it. And they agreed to do that. Benefit of getting older and having gray hairs, you can say things like that. So I really enjoy that. And that's what I mean by being a practitioner activist. So what we did was we took the housing instruments. We have subsidized housing available to certain categories of people, 0 to 15,000 rands of income per month. And we said, we know that a strategy for most households is that once they acquire any kind of accommodation, they rent as much space as possible that helps them to earn some income. If the housing is built well, it improves the asset value. That means that they can raise bonds in order to do extensions and improvements. So to optimize the capex that the government is spending is very, very important. And we've got to create decent settlements so that it increases the property values of where people are living. And people will very rapidly improve what they own within the space of 3 to 5 years. Livelihood strategies are important. Again, they're in the heart of the jobless area. Can the settlement itself generate some work that helps to support the OPEX, the operational costs of what they have to live with, so that they can afford to pay their rent, their electricity, their water bills, etc., etc. Governance is an issue when you create very dense settlements. There's a lot of breakdown, so it's really important to understand how that is structured. So we came up with a local area governance policy that is to be structured along a one payment cell phone platform, so that that becomes a way of monitoring the way in which people are behaving and incentivizing behavior. And that is then focused on transitioning the behavior change that we want to see between 5 and 10 years, because when people live in even denser settlements that well constructed, that behavior change becomes very important. And the procurement of this is that you don't go out the conventional way of procuring, but you procure this in a way that also optimizes the way in which land, services, buildings, building materials, and resources are used. So we also showed them how that looks. So some of what I'm going to share with you is about saying, yes, this was about designing a settlement, but actually we thought about every aspect of it to see how we could maximize the opportunity that the housing affords. So these were summary snapshots that we created so that we could have 10 slides to share with the government. I'm going to share it to you in a bit more detail, and if we run out of time, that's also okay. But this is to show you that we have brought to the upgrade of an informal settlement a city-making lens. We're saying that it doesn't matter if these people are poor, we must apply the same way of thinking to these areas that we apply elsewhere. So the figure on the left just shows the growth of the informal settlements. The figure down at the bottom shows the actual availability of land, which you can see is very little. That then led us to motivate to the government that instead of putting houses on individual plots in a row, if we stack them up, we save on land and we save on the infrastructure. Some of the highest costs are your bulk and your link infrastructure in order to go further and further out to the periphery. And we said that 4 subsidies worth of funding can be allocated to the equivalent of 1 site, and then we can go up an extra story or create extra accommodation so that people can have rentable space, etc. And then on the roofs of all of the buildings, we want to create rooftop farming
solar energy generation, have agri-hubs, have water resilience, waste reuse, stimulate a local economy, and provide local goods and services. That in turn would reduce the livability costs and ensure that quite a lot of their costs were met. It was also important that even if it's at the bottom end of the income spectrum, that we have a mix of accommodation. So B&G is our program that offers subsidized housing. There are a lot of people who are not eligible for housing because our housing backlog is so great. People under 45, even though they qualify, will not get housing, but they might get a serviced site. But we've run out of land. So we said, okay, let's create shacks in the sky, but they will also get a shell which they will complete themselves. And the gap housing is for blue-collar workers who are nurses, doctors, teachers, etc., who can afford housing. And we said, let's bring some of them in as well because we change the actual flavor of the settlements. And often these are people who are linked into the community. So we try to address that spectrum of things, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with you. Looking more closely at the grain of Kosovo, what you will see is that you can see the kind of major loops of roads which were carved into the informal settlement about 20 years ago. And then a lot of the other routes are informal, and our city engineer had to walk with a stick and nudge the shacks out in order to create that opening and corridor so that people could access their shacks, but also that emergency vehicles can get in. We have winter rainfall with a very high water table, so every year there is flooding, and so lots of people are sitting with water up to their knees, but particularly in the summers we have extreme winds, and a lot of the folk that live here move between the rural areas and here. So a lot of the food that they cook when they've run out of electricity is on open fires. So if it's the candle or the paraffin lamp that falls over, every year we have 500 to 1,000, 1,500 shacks burning down. So these routes become very important as evacuation zones. And typically what happens is that people throw their goods into the road in order to save them, and then you can't save the lives. So we acknowledge that. We then also looked at the land assembly, and we said, how does that work? If you look at the adjacent areas and all the assets in the surrounding areas, there are schools, there are meeting areas, there's a major stadium, and again, we went to national government, we said this is a stadium that is training the police academy, please will you move elsewhere and give this land to these communities, because there are no facilities for most of these communities. Right next door to Kosovo is a formal settlement of 15,000 households. They're probably more like 30 to 45,000 households living in there. So there's a dire need for social and other facilities. On the right-hand side, where it says Philippi Stadium, is actually a colored area. And again, there's disparities there, and you can see that the grain of the city looks different. So to start this process, we came up with a block. What the city agreed with us is that we could restructure the way in which people are located into large urban blocks. The large urban blocks would then have a certain density, and to create those, we would create the roads, we would create the green areas, which is public open space. The brown areas is where social facilities would be located. The pink areas is where detention ponds are located because the water table is very high. And everywhere that we then have roads and any of these facilities are shacks that we would have to take out of those spaces and relocate elsewhere. So we computed that and we worked out where it would go. By the way, if you look up at the top is the railway line. This is the second most busy railway station in the city, but it doesn't look like that, it doesn't act like that. And what happened over COVID is that people were so desperate to try and de-densify that they went and they squatted on the railway lines. So this is where the trains came and slept at night, and they can no longer do that. So part of that is also being cleared. So we are in a state of crisis with regard to our housing. Looking just at the urban blocks then, this is what would remain. We created an inventory of each block and the number of households that will remain. We took the other spaces and counted up the numbers. It's wonderful with ArchiCAD. As we put the dots on, it pops up the numbers automatically, so that's quite fantastic. And then we said what's important is to put in the green streets. There's something, because this land sits on an aquifer, called the managed aquifer recharge system. If you plant a whole lot of particular kinds of trees, like hybrid eucalyptus trees, and in our country, eucalyptus trees are a no-no because they suck up too much water. In this instance, we do want to suck up water in the winter because we want the water table to settle slightly lower than it is currently, which would help with the tuberculosis rate. However, the trees would also act as a windbreak, and it would also allow actually the ongoing recharge of the aquifer. So we did that, and the hierarchy of streets is informed by double avenues of trees, single avenues of trees, etc. You'll see that the central column of trees has a double avenue, and that's a pedestrian prioritized street because most people walk. The distance from one corner of the site to the other corner of the site is just over 1 kilometer, so it's very walkable. Each block was then divided into two so that they could have 2 service points. And again, we inventoried that, and we also identified the hierarchy of the streets quite carefully. And in each block, the ratio of taps to households is 25, and the ratio of toilets to household is 5. Right now in the existing city settlement, there are up to 40 households that share a toilet. So now I'm going to go very fast because this is just showing you the methodology of how we work through. When the whole plan comes together, this is what it looks like. And now we apply the urban design framing. Of course, this diagram came at the end after we'd done a lot of iterative work back and forth between ourselves, the engineers, the urban designers, the planners, our clients, etc. So here we look at the creation of gateways so that each entry into the settlement is quite distinctive. There's a sense of identity. There's a hierarchy of routes. The wayfinding is quite interesting because when you arrive, you can see where things are happening. That transverse corridor supports mixed use, so it's formal, it's 3 to 4 story housing, and the north-south is 16 meters, and then the brown loop road is where your evacuation services, etc., can continue because people are still going to continue living in shacks for quite a while. The clustering of the public and social spaces becomes quite important, and they're linked by the pedestrian route so people can walk up and down the site in quite a safe fashion. So here you see the gateways, the economic web. This is the dominant economic web, but of course also where you have the clustering of social spaces is where quite a lot of activity around the shops, etc., will happen. We have what we call the spaza shops, where people will operate out of their front room and sell food and vegetables and beer and all sorts of things like that. This is the socioeconomic web then applied to it, which becomes quite extensive. Services and emergency routes, mixed use and informal trading streets. And now you have the housing super blocks with their service points. What this means is that we have said to the city up front that over-design your service routes. What we have found is that settlements that were designed for 3,000 households will end up having 15 to 20,000 households. Every day the water works, the sewage works, the electricity works are popping. They are bursting apart because there's too much of overload. So we said anticipate the overload. It's going to happen here as well. If this is a site on the edge of a station, anticipate that your density is going to be beyond imaginable and allow for that. So they start off by just putting the bulks, which is the marginal extra overcost to what they would put in anyway. What that allows is each super block has the opportunity to be developed in a different way. And there are financial and other mechanisms being worked on that would allow for a whole variety of development options to be able to come about because there's common tenure owned by a bunch of people. A very simple version on one of the super blocks of their tenure is that you create very simple row housing, 10 meters by 4.5 meters wide, such that the roofscape is continuous, such that the roofscape actually becomes an energy generator. Our city has now just invented independent power generation regulations, so they can be a business that actually puts surplus energy back into the grid after they've satisfied their needs. On the 2 corners, you see the service blocks, which captures the ratio of taps and toilets that are required. Not perfect, not ideal, but safe. And then the future development options is that they can develop single row housing, perimeter blocks, duplexes, and the type of zoning that we've chosen allows them to have mixed use anywhere and to go up to 4 and 5 stories maximum on a walk-up basis. 90% coverage, and we motivated for a reduction in the parking, and that the parking is allowed to be in the street. So the front boundary setback is 0 meters, and they need to have a setback on the back boundary for breathability. So the sizing of the sites and the shape of the sites were very carefully considered as well. This now shows a little bit of what the row housing could look like. And again, with an external staircase, you can have a flatlet at the bottom that you rent, and then upstairs you can get an opportunity to have a double-story construction. So on 3-story construction, this is now one of the wider streets, you see a way in which the traffic, the trees, which are critical, the people, bicycle lanes, all of that interacts. On another 25-meter street, you see a different configuration of what goes on. There's 16-meter streets, which also allows all of those things. And this is also for the breathability and the safety, because until they get to this point, they're sitting within shacks, which still requires the evacuation requirements. This is pixelated, I apologize. And my editor forgot to swing it around, but thank you very much. And this is a summation of the urban design framing, where we're saying the base layer is the land assembly and getting the zoning rights, and then you get your movement systems, then you get your infrastructure and your detention ponds, then you begin to create the actual building up of the public spaces, etc., then the housing, and the whole thing then comes together. So that is the first part, and these are just some visuals of what that looks like. There are many, many visuals. We're working in collaboration with a bunch of teams. Some of this work comes from other teams. And just this shows you the many different ways in which they can develop this. 4-story housing, in this instance, it's got tired and is sleeping, or 5-story housing. And this was a project that we built very quickly as an example for the city, where within a month, we took people who were living in shacks, 10 units, out of a 10 by 40 square meter site. They went and found accommodation in the surrounding areas. They came back and they built the shell with 10 units. In 30 days, the city then came in afterwards and put in the services. And we're not going to win any prizes for this, but I'm very happy that it's provided very good roofs over people's heads. And although the site is 10 by 4.5, it allows for a double-story extension to the front, which can allow a lot of self-expression and identity creation in the way in which the front is developed. Perimeter blocks can provide 25 square meters within which, designed carefully, very easily a 4-person family can live, with a curtain separating a double bed and then bunk beds, and then washing and servicing and etc. happening on the ends. So these are some of the examples, and I can share clearer examples with you. So now I'm going to go to the wedge and show you the second site that we worked on. How much time do I have? Can somebody tell me, please? 30 minutes. Perfect. So this site used to be agriculturally zoned. It's made up of a number of different sites used to be owned by different owners. What you see in green and blue is a site that's going to be developed by a private developer with a very big shopping center and maybe a school or a clinic. They will probably put a boundary up and not allow poorer people to access that. So again, we looked at those sites and we said, let's apply some design and development principles. So it's important that we have east-west connectivity into the site, that the access routes are clear. They also are determined by the city. They don't want too many entry points into these settlements because they share a boundary of the Philippi horticultural area. We have to create a transport and mixed-use hub. So the green zone that you see with the little red asterisks is where the transport hub will be created. And then this represents one village of a number of village clusters that will happen further north. There's a hierarchy of places and spaces that are defined in the settlement, and particularly each block is structured as a neighborhood, as a walkable neighborhood. There are views and landmarks. There's a hierarchy of living streets. Living streets is where we encourage people to spill out, play soccer, the kids can play, grannies can sit out like that, and that there's housing and funding eligibility. Again, the kinds of instruments that are available at housing level is the subsidized housing, in this instance, there's also something called the small-scale developer plots. What our government has discovered is that in our informal settlements, where some people have managed to assemble a little bit of money or they syndicate the money, they take a couple of sites together and they develop it. And that allows them to then build 2-3-story multiple housing where a family lives in one room. It's not uncommon in many parts of India. I saw this before and I'm sure it still prevails. The density matrix of this is that we're looking at 200 dwelling units per hectare on 3 to 4 story construction. And again, the footprint we have to work with is what the government's policy allows, which is single and double story footprint. But we've said to the city, please use the zoning to size the services to anticipate a future growth where there's going to be probably a doubling of the density. We had to work very hard to assemble the site. There's always contestation between provincial government and the city of Cape Town. Our client is the provincial government. So if you see that little triangle corner of site, the city said, we're not giving that to you, it's useless to them. And I said, okay, fine, we'll design around it. And right now my office is redesigning it. I'm known to go and rattle the cages of everybody up to the top, to the mayor and the premier. I will not rest till we get that piece of land. And then we had to just think sensibly about all the boundaries. Just above us is a informal settlement where the private owner actually allowed all the sand to be mined away. The sand in this part of the world is very good for construction purposes. And then he allowed the squatters to come. The squatters are sitting in a swimming pool. Every winter they're in water. So the minute we start with the site, we know that that community is going to come and protest, and we're going to have to deal with that. We've parked that problem for the moment because there are other sites being developed as well, but it's important that we use the site very well. Again, we've taken the notion of gateways, landmarks, edges. Some of the lines have not printed through correctly, so I apologize, but the final drawing brings it all together. There are mixed-use zones. Now, the orange zones that you see, the deep orange zones, that is where the micro-developers can come. We now have the financial mechanisms that allows them to raise the capital, so they can create shopping at the bottom, leave some space for informal trading, and then create residential above that. It's a win-win because they then become landowners, so it's developing small-scale landowners, and the sites are all subdivided, so they can do 2 or 3 sites at a time, or they can take up the whole piece. And then internally, what we've got is, again, a perimeter core with hired formal housing, and then inside of it, service sites where the sites are very, very small. The services and emergency routes hug the inner core to allow for fire and emergency vehicles to be able to run through, and also the waste trucks, etc. And then we've got the street typologies with the hierarchy of wider streets and narrower streets. Apologies, the image quality is not that fantastic. And then we have the internal pedestrian prioritized streets so that children could walk to the early childcare centers. In this instance, the tan irregular site in the middle is the primary school. It is large enough to carry a vertical primary and high school with shared facilities. We're negotiating that with our government. They tend to be rigid about, the education department tends to be rigid about what they'll allow and won't allow. You can see here we had left out the triangle, and just in the last week we've now been given permission to incorporate that triangle. We work with the notion of views and vistas. So again, if you can't afford to put money into everything, we know that the churches will create something really beautiful, and we put the parks adjacent to those. So those are the kinds of places where the community activities go. We have a very religious community with lots of gatherings every day. And right across the way from the park is where all the taverns will be, so all the drinking happens there. But it means that the children can be looked after at the park as well. And so this is now where the whole diagram comes together. You can see the bigger sites on the periphery, the smaller sites in the middle, the pedestrian zones, again with the notion of managed aquifer, recharge with the green zones that we create. The other streets also have trees. This diagram just has not captured that. And in the legend here, you'll see on the central axis, number 1 is the church or the community center. The blue blob is the early childcare facility. We have some of the highest rates of child abuse in the country, if not in parts of the world. It's a function of the breakdown of our families through generations of very harsh conditions where 80% of the population was forced out of the city, sent to 20% of the land. Then the men were brought back on a pass system to work in the city, and that broke down the family system. And so there's a lot of trauma in these societies. And then the blue is the park, and then the corner sites have the opportunity to respond in many different ways. These are suggestions. It stops nobody from being able to start a shop or a work from home kind of setup from their homes. Again, the street sections, again, just designate clearly for the city's perspective how things will work. Of course, most people don't follow all the rules, but we've designed the streets so that they can operate fairly safely. And again, this is how the whole pattern comes together from the land assembly, the services, the detention ponds, the basic public facilities and amenities, the housing blocks, and then the rest of it completed. So that was the second project. Now the third project is extremely interesting, but I've had to tone some of my ambitions down, but I'm going to share this with you anyway. So this is a land that belongs in a private trust. They agreed to bring it together with the government because the trustees, of which there are 800, would get accelerated on the housing list. And it's a piece of land that already has quite a lot of investment on it. The square with the grey buildings is a bunch of very large sheds. So they do timber recycling, they do timber planing, and they supply the timber industry. Those sheds can be used to harvest the food from the horticultural area, bring it here and create a depot for food. There can be wholesaling, so that this entire wedge tract of land, which is 100 hectares, ultimately will have about 30,000 households. This will be their shopping area. And then inside of it, we've created the blue zones, which are schools. Each neighborhood is about 500 households to 700 households. And again, it has a particular pattern along which it's been designed. Again, a very clear hierarchy of streets that give you access, but then creating internally visually protected zones, not gated communities. The yellow bands are 4 to 5 story structures, which is for the government project. And the white sites in the middle belong to the community trust members, and they will have 2 to 3 stories. Again, this entire project is structured so that the roofscape can basically provide a proper business, 5-hectare PV generation business and photovoltaic energy generational business, and grow foods on the rooftops. Now, the red zones is where we encourage 3 and 4 story construction, where all the activity can spill out into the central zone, which becomes a community zone. And then the white streets are play streets, so you can park a car on the edge or in the streets, and then the tan color streets actually allow you to drive through. Between the blocks are parking courtyards, but which during the day are empty, so they are also where children can play. Again, an emphasis on lots of trees. We live in a very arid part of the world. We get some of the least rainfall in the country, but in summer it gets very hot. And the climate change scenario, we're looking at a 3 to 5 degree increase in temperatures in the next few years. So the open heat island effect is a very real thing, and the groundwater recharge is a very, very real thing. Again, applying the city-making principles, access gateways, a network of public spaces. The green zone at the top is an ESCOM, it's our electricity servitude. And so what happens is that within each neighborhood block on the corners, we've recessed the spaces, we've created early childcare facilities and public spaces with playgrounds, and those then become the collection points where people can bring their organic waste. Our city is creating legislation where you will not be allowed to put your organic waste into the garbage. So you've got to try and compost it and retain the nutrients on site. That gets collected, taken to the electricity servitude, where you're allowed to compost that, and that then becomes the nurseries for generating some of the seedlings, which then go to the rooftops and get grown. Each neighborhood becomes a business entity and a management unit. So we have 1 to 7 residential, 8 is an agribusiness hub, 9 is a commercial hub, and 10 is the educational facility. The economic webs are localized inside of the neighborhood area, so there's a consciousness that what you spend in your neighborhood goes into the pockets of your neighbors, and things you can't get there, you then get further out of there. And then these are the green and blue systems. Instead of giving up a whole lot of land to detention ponds, we've acknowledged that some of these central spaces may be flooded for a few weeks when there's extreme rain. But its percolation allows for that to dry out very rapidly. And then the green is where we have the 2 to 3 story housing. The tan color is where we have the 4-story housing. And so what we then have, these are the collection points. The collection points are also what drives the behavior change. So when you drop off your things, you get a token, a cell phone token. So one cell phone payment system again. The corners of the tall buildings have Wi-Fi free zones. You can go and log in and do an exercise which teaches you a whole lot of skills about urban management, about energy saving, etc. You can log in your data around the performance of your household, and you get incentives as a result of that. This was a global workshop that we created with people who are doing energy generation projects on other parts of the continent, and these were some of their suggestions, and it's very much set up on a business basis. So here then you have 2,800 households that can live, work, and play in this neighborhood where typically it would just be a ghetto. This is the format of the housing. This is not architecture. So the people who own the housing can actually get their housing, which is 40 square meters, and the slot in the middle can grow into their middle class house of 80 square meters. But until they get there, they can fill that in and they can pre-fund it. And the pre-funding allows them to then have tenants in the middle. The one to the right is the rental micro apartments, the shacks in the sky, and then the ones at the bottom is the private housing. We showed them that this way of building would generate a 13.5% surplus in terms of what the government would spend. That's the money that can be used to raise the funding to cause all the additional things in the project to happen. And the income, all members are part of the solar energy business and the food business. They get a monthly allowance from that as their dividend, and that allows them to pay for the costs. And these are just some of the details of the rooftop energy, 5 hectares. And we can manage the water because the laundries are all based at the top. So all the water is recycled that comes out of the grey water and can be used for laundry and toilet flushing. We factored in the cost of the reticulation. So instead of 50 litres per person per household, which is an unsafe consumption in a poor community with a high disease vector, we've increased it to 75 litres. They're still under the prepaid free limit that they can access, and the demand on the grid is reduced, and we show that there's a profit share of 1,300 rands per household that goes towards the household, which allows the children to be fed better and for them to pay for their medicinal uses as well. And the hub then provides goods and services for 9,000 to double that number of people. And we've approached our local university, which has set up a governance school to then train the people in order to create that governance unit at the neighborhood level. So you'll notice that in each of our projects, we're trying to work with either the urban block or the governance unit so that we can rethink the financial architecture, the actual architecture, the income generation architecture, and then the actual format of the housing itself. The housing is a machine for living. I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your knowledge of this important topic. Now we will be having a quick Q&A session for questions.
Sure. I know it's a lot of information, and the work that we do only comes together after many years of working. I saw some of your foundation work that you do, and every bit that you're doing around understanding the ergonomics, the size of things, etc., factors into this, because this is very, very tight design. So there's no question that's stupid in my book. and all questions allowed.
Ma'am, in all the plans you make the zoning very strict. So why not make it less strict? Make it, instead of 4-story houses, you make it high density residential or low density residential.
We chose 4-story housing because well, it's not 4-story, it's 4 or 5 stories. It's a height restriction. We have to put a zoning in when we apply for the rights because the infrastructure is calculated on the base of that density. And our city isn't in a position, and the actual financials of building above something that is a walk-up pushes it out of cost at the moment. But that's a very good question. And certainly in my book, we should be going much higher. But that's part of the negotiation, and that's where we managed to at least push it from 2-story to about 4 to 5-story.
One more thing, everything is government constructed in the plans you make there.
We're working on other projects where we take government land and we package it, we de-risk it, and we secure the development rights, and then it's developed and delivered by private developers. In this instance, the government will put it out for procurement, but it will be built by private sector construction agencies. That's just their pattern. We haven't been able to break their pattern. But right now, because of the 3 components of this project, they're busy rethinking, and we actually part of that discussion to see if that could actually be procured differently. So our appointment ends at the end of the stage, and that gives them a chance to rethink how they're going to procure it.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I'm sorry that it's not beautiful architecture yet. Go ahead.
Okay. How difficult is it to convince the government of your projects and procure that land?
It's very important that we don't try and create a policy change. So that's why we've worked within the rules of our zoning scheme. Over the years, our zoning scheme has changed to acknowledge this particular problem. And we intersect also a lot with policy. We have good relationships with the Premier. We have good relationships at the presidential level as well. One of the benefits of being a struggle activist is that I have the hotline all the way to the top. So when I really need to make a noise, I do make a noise, but I use it very carefully. I think everybody's grappling. I think everybody's grappling with how we make housing affordable, how we make it comfortable, and how we also find a way of people actually being able to pay their costs along the way. Otherwise, a lot of this housing is sunk cost. You never ever recover anything else back. And so there's no maintenance. So we are getting a good listening. And as I said, there's another project I could have shown you where we've taken a piece of land and we've rezoned it and we've done the financial modeling. So we act as the urban designers and architects for a transaction advisory service to the government, which then says this is possible. In this mix, 30% is affordable, 30% is for the gap housing, which teachers, etc., and maybe 30% is for the market. So that's another way where we don't create ghettos. Our biggest need is at the lowest end for affordable housing. Those are the shacks in the sky, and that's also quite important. We haven't had a breakthrough. In one of the slides that I showed, you'll see that when you stack them up just by themselves, and if you did that everywhere, you run a deficit. But if you mix it into the other projects, the overall project comes up with a surplus. So the financial modeling becomes very, very important. And you can only achieve that financial benefit if you actually procure it in a particular way. So that's ongoing discussions we're having. And then you've got to work with the community to persuade them that this is desirable. But over the years, they have now come to understand that they either find a way of living with this and dealing with the behavior change that's needed, or they get shunted about 30 kilometers to the periphery where there's no schools and no public transport. Go ahead.
With the racial barriers in mind, how do you decide the zoning of a particular area? Like, if there are different types of people living in the same zone, how do you differ? Like, how do you decide this zone should be there and the other should be there?
We have quite good guidelines about the zoning. And the question that gentleman was asking was around, why didn't you go for 8 stories? So it's a negotiation. We first test the availability of infrastructure in the city grid and the projected infrastructure, and it's all tied to the government's ability to pay. We know that they're not going to achieve the 8-story, and in the end, the Kosovo project itself should be 8-story, and I'm hoping that over time, if they don't do it very fast, in the next 3 to 4 years, we'll have those breakthroughs coming through. So we choose the best of the zoning. We could have chosen an MU1 zoning, mixed use 1, but that has a very high parking ratio, because typically our zoning schemes were designed for the conventional housing and settlements and developments. So mostly our policies have actually been poor blind, and they had a different set of rules in terms of the roads hierarchies. Even the pipes that they put into these settlements were under-designed. We have an engineering system of over-designing engineering infrastructure, but in these townships, after 1993, they under-designed them. So what we did was we did an assessment of all of these settlements, and we showed them over time how their sites have become smaller, but also that their services, pipe sizes, and the quality of the pipes were reduced, and that's actually costing them more than it would have if they'd done it better. So we're now driving that backwards. So it's a journey. It's a journey, and you have to have the resilience and the fight to be able to do that. That's why I have a lot of gray hair. Anybody else?
Ma'am, I wanted to ask, what was one of the priorities that you had while going into this project?
Please bring it closer so I can hear you.
Sorry. What was one of the priorities that you had while going into the project, where to provide low cost, like to provide better housing, this is one of the things that had to be there, that was from the government that you had to get?
I've been involved in the community of Kosovo for 20 years. When they did the first lot of roads and things, the engineers actually appointed us to provide urban design services so that they could reduce the abortive costs. So that is a different set of mapping that we did, where we put high mast lighting, we put a more detailed level of service courtyards where people could do their laundry, etc., because the idea was that they would probably permanently remain in that state. Then our government began to do quite well financially just before COVID. So they actually said to us, we want to do medium density housing. We're actually going to build 3- and 4-story housing. So that was their priority. We showed them how that could work, and that's where the VUSI project was then conceived. We have done probably about 10 different urban design schemes on the Kosovo site, where we showed them how they could retain that total population on that site and still have public open space. They didn't really have the understanding or the finance to be able to realize it, and the biggest constraint has been the availability of sanitation and stormwater capacity and electricity in the grid. Because we're very landlocked, the ability to create additional sanitation capacity is quite restricted. So we need to upgrade that quite fast. So this is now the optimum solution, and the priorities are driven by that. But we've taken a practical view in Kosovo where we're saying that the urban block in any event needs to be safe for a woman or a child who doesn't get raped just going to the toilet. And so, that's the kind of view we've taken, that we're sensible, we're on the ground. At the same time, we look like we're smooth sailing on the water, but our legs are paddling like ducks in the water, and we're motivating to the government around these finance systems. There's the Center for African Housing Studies, CAHS, I think CAF. And they have done very, very interesting studies around low-income housing as well. And they are also looking at breakthrough on the continent around how the funding is actually addressed, particularly, that facilitates low-income people. So the minute you own a site and you own a top structure, you actually have asset value. But if it's not well structured, you can't trade on it. You and I can go to the bank and get a mortgage. They can't. But if you structure it well, they can get a mortgage. So those instruments are beginning to come in place. So the priorities are practical, but they're also long-sighted to say, in 20 years, what could or should this look like? It's going to happen anyway. Yeah.
Hello, ma'am. I just wanted to ask if, like, what is the level of public participation when it comes to like design, and how much involvement at what levels are these people who are like living in this squads are involved?
We have a very well-structured representation system. Every ward has a councillor. The Kosovo councillor is a different councillor from the Vusi councillor, is a different councillor from the Wedge councillor. We've worked through those structures, and then there are community committees. We've worked through the community committees as well. So they're aware of what's going on. In the Vusi community, because that was a community trust, they were being supported by Shack Dwellers International via an organization called Community Organization Resource Center. They did very practical workshops on the ground where they literally built little models of the entire project, and that's the final result of that negotiation. Fortunately, that was not part of our project cost. We have a conventional appointment to provide urban design and planning services. We have architectural partners who support us on what the actual format of the architecture could look like. But we do not have a fund for community facilitation, so we invited the NGO to do that. Once we've created the structure of what's available, now the actual discussion process begins with the community. So what will happen now is we did an enumeration survey where everybody was informed and aware of what is coming, and they understand their classification in terms of the eligibility. The next process will be registration, which is also part of a community education service, and that is part of the project. So then they become aware of their rights. And inside of their rights, the system of what we've created gives them the options of what they have. So the people who choose to come out of those streets and those public facilities and be relocated to the Wedge might access their housing quicker, but they give up the right to be close to their community and their family where they are. So there's always trade-offs. So it's a game board, and we will introduce that game board, and there's a special unit that does that community facilitation. Language is a big barrier. A lot of the people don't speak proper English. A lot of them are also newly emerged from the rural areas. So it's a patient game. But yeah, lot of interaction.
Okay. Sorry, the other question is, do South Africa, or specifically in this case Cape Town, have like acts which help us do this kind of rezoning, or it adversely kind of like forces us to do things in certain manner? Let's say we all understand like it's like G+4, that's where you don't require lifts and it's much more easier. What's the case in terms of in that case for like when this is almost reconstitution of land, and are there, let's say, parameters to this is what the roads percentage of road should be, this is what the percentage of, let's say, open spaces or community spaces should be? If it is there, does
Yes.
it help, or does it like adversely work against us?
When it comes to the public spaces and the open spaces, etc., it definitely helps. When it comes to the roads, it's sometimes a bit rigid. But what we've done, what I do now as a strategy is when we go into the pre-planning interaction with the city, and doing things online has helped a lot because you can very rapidly assemble the 10 or 20 players that you have to interact with. I do the presentations myself, and I'm a force to be reckoned with. So I put my foot down, and I'm not easily pushable. However, we do have to compromise. So there's a level of practicality that people do bring to the party. So the road widths that we're working with in each of the settlements vary ever so slightly. And we then have a very robust discussion on what the real threats are and what the real kind of safety parameters are, and then we adjust accordingly. You need to have a level of experience to be able to do that. And fortunately, my engineering partners are really, really great as well. And I just said to them, throw your rule book out the window, I'm not interested. Give me the practicalities of what's going to keep this population safe. Because you and I want to sleep well at night, knowing that we've done a good job. And the officials are very open to that as well. They know that I'm not going to go away. I really will not go away. I have actually, so part of our struggle tactics was we would actually go into a sit-in. And I'll go into an official's office, and I'm sitting here until we find a solution. I'm not moving. You can bring me water, you can bring me food or not, doesn't matter. I'll do that. We also have a collaborative opportunity with, there are not many practitioners who do this kind of work, but from time to time we have the opportunity to come together and swap notes and deepen our tactics, so we do that.
Thank you, ma'am, on behalf of the Central University for giving us this wonderful opportunity. Good afternoon. Now let's end today's session with a big round of applause for Ms. Gita Goven.
Thank you very much. I hope I haven't scared you. This is wonderful work. There's a very large part of the population globally that needs this kind of input, so I welcome you. It's a lot of fun, a lot of creativity, and I think where you guys are going with the AI and the technologies, etc., it's a brave new world coming up. So I wish you all very well with your studies, and the girls definitely don't give up. Hang in there and fight the good fight. It's important. Great. Thank you very much.